The old bridge stood like a silent sentinel over the murky river, its iron trusses rusted and warped with age. The road that led to it was cracked and potholed, rarely traveled now except by the brave or the ignorant. Locals had a name for it: the Ghastly Bridge. They spoke of it in hushed tones, wary of summoning the spirits that were said to haunt its length. Emily had heard the story since childhood. Tales of spectral figures appearing in the dead of night, of drivers swerving to avoid unseen obstacles only to crash through the fragile guardrails and plunge into the river below. Each story seemed more gruesome than the last, each victim's fate more tragic. The bridge was a local legend, a ghost story to frighten children and ward off curious teens. But Emily wasn't afraid. She was curious. "Come on, Em," her friend Jake had said earlier that evening. "It's just a bunch of old stories. We drive across, maybe snap a few pics, and we'll have something to talk about forever." She had agreed, partly out of a sense of adventure, partly to prove to herself that she wasn't scared of a silly old bridge. Now, as she stood at the edge of the road, staring at the shadowy outline of the bridge, she felt a shiver of apprehension. "Let's go," Jake urged, his voice breaking the silence. He was already halfway to his car, his face lit with excitement and the faint glow of his phone screen. Emily took a deep breath and followed. As she climbed into the passenger seat, she glanced at the others in their group. There was Sarah, clutching her jacket tightly around her, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Next to her was Mike, who had brought his video camera, determined to capture any paranormal activity they might encounter. Jake started the car, and they began their slow approach. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted metal and crumbling asphalt. Emily's heart pounded louder with each passing moment. "Remember," Jake said, his voice filled with mock seriousness, "midnight is when the spirits are supposed to be most active. We've got about 5 minutes." The car rolled onto the bridge, the tires thumping over uneven boards. The air seemed to grow colder, and a mist began to rise from the river, swirling around them like ghostly fingers. Emily peered out the window, her breath fogging up the glass. For a moment she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the bridge, but when she blinked, it was gone. She shook her head, trying to dispel the growing unease. As they reached the midpoint, Jake slowed the car to a crawl. "All right, let's see if we can spot any ghosts," he said with a nervous chuckle. Sarah's eyes darted around, and Mike had his camera ready, filming the darkness beyond the windows. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft creaking of the bridge and the distant rush of the river below. Suddenly the car lurched, as if something had struck it from behind. Emily gasped, and Jake swore under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Jake glanced in the rearview mirror, his face pale. "I don't know. Maybe an animal?" But Emily knew better. She could feel the presence of something unseen, something malevolent. The stories were true. The spirits of the bridge were real, and they were not happy. A low, mournful wail rose from the river, echoing through the night. The mist thickened, enveloping the car in a shroud of cold, clammy fog. Emily's heart raced as she saw the figure again, this time standing directly in front of them, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. Jake slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car slid forward, and the figure disappeared under the hood with a sickening thud. The group sat in stunned silence, the only sound their ragged breathing and the creak of the old bridge. "We hit something," Mike said, his voice barely audible. "No," Emily whispered. her eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had stood. It wasn't something. It was someone. As the realization sank in, the air grew colder still, and the sense of dread intensified. They were not alone on the bridge. The spirits were there, watching, waiting, and they were just getting started. Emily's heart pounded as Jake reversed the car, the tires screeching against the damp, cracked pavement. She couldn't shake the image of the glowing eyes and the figure that had vanished under the car. Silence filled the vehicle, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant croak of a bullfrog and the hum of the engine. "We should leave," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We shouldn't have come here." "Let's just get off this bridge," Jake replied, his voice steadier than Emily expected. He was trying to stay calm, but the tension was clear in his furrowed brow and tight grip on the steering wheel. The car moved slowly forward, the mist swirling thicker around them, almost as if it were alive, pressing against the windows. Emily's breath fogged up the glass and she wiped it with a shaky hand, peering into the darkness beyond. "Did you get that on camera?" Emily asked Mike, trying to distract herself from the fear creeping into her mind. Mike nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I got it. I think we should review the footage later, see what we really hit. Maybe it was just an animal." But Emily knew better. The stories of the ghostly bridge had been passed down for generations. Legends of drivers losing control of their cars, crashing into the river, and never being found. Or worse, being found with expressions of sheer terror frozen on their faces. As they reached the end of the bridge, the car's headlights illuminated the road ahead, and the mist began to thin. Relief washed over Emily. Maybe they could just leave this place behind and never return. But then the car stalled. The engine sputtered and died, leaving them in complete darkness. Jake cursed, turning the key in the ignition, but the car refused to start. "Great, just great," Jake muttered, hitting the steering wheel in frustration. A chill ran down Emily's spine, and she glanced around nervously. The mist seemed to be closing in again, and the oppressive silence was back, heavier than before. "We need to get out and push," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just get us off the bridge, and we can call for help." Reluctantly, they all climbed out of the car. The night air was cold and damp, and Emily could see her breath in the dim light. The bridge loomed behind them, a dark and menacing shadow. As they began to push, the car inched forward slowly. The mist swirled around their legs, and Emily felt as if unseen eyes were watching them from every direction. The silence was broken only by their grunts of effort and the creak of the bridge under their weight. Suddenly, a low, guttural moan echoed through the night. Emily froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound was coming from the bridge, growing louder and more insistent. "Keep pushing," Jake urged, his voice filled with panic. They moved faster, the car inching forward painfully slow. The moan turned into a wail, high-pitched and filled with anguish. Emily felt tears prick her eyes, the sound resonating deep within her soul, stirring a primal fear. And then she saw them. Figures emerging from the mist, pale and translucent, their eyes glowing with an unearthly light. They moved silently, gliding across the bridge, their expressions twisted in sorrow and rage. "Jake, hurry!" Sarah screamed, her voice piercing the night. But it was too late. The figures were upon them, reaching out with cold, clammy hands. Emily felt a ghostly touch on her shoulder, and she screamed, jerking away in terror. The car finally lurched forward, rolling off the bridge and onto solid ground. Jake jumped back into the driver's seat, frantically turning the key. This time, the engine roared to life, and they sped away from the bridge, leaving the ghostly figures behind. Emily sat back, her heart racing, her mind reeling. The legends were true. The spirits of the ghostly bridge were real, and they were not at peace. The wails of the dead echoed in her mind as they drove away, a haunting reminder that some places should never be disturbed. As the car sped down the dark road, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they had awakened something ancient and malevolent, something that wouldn't rest until it had claimed its due. The next morning, Emily woke with a start, her heart still pounding from the nightmare that had plagued her sleep. She had dreamt of the bridge, of the figures that had emerged from the mist, their eyes glowing with a spectral light. Shaking off the remnants of fear, she glanced at her phone and saw a message from Jake. "Jake, meet at Mike's place at noon. Need to review the footage." Emily sighed, her curiosity mingling with a sense of dread. She had hoped to put the previous night behind her, but it seemed her friends were determined to uncover the truth. She got ready and headed to Mike's house, the morning sun doing little to dispel the chill that lingered in her bones. When she arrived, Jake, Sarah, and Mike were already there, their faces drawn and tired. Mike had set up his laptop, and the camera was connected, ready to play back the footage they had captured. "Let's see what we got," Mike said, his voice heavy with anticipation. They gathered around as the video started. The screen showed their drive onto the bridge, the mist swirling around the car. As the footage played, Emily felt her pulse quicken, reliving the fear and tension of the night before. Then the camera caught it, the figure standing in the middle of the bridge, its eyes glowing eerily. Emily gasped, and Sarah covered her mouth with her hand. "It's real," Jake whispered, his eyes wide with shock. "We actually saw a ghost." The footage continued, showing the moment the car lurched and the ghostly figure vanished under the hood. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. It was undeniable now. The legends of the ghostly bridge were true. "We need to find out more about this bridge," Emily said, her voice trembling but determined. "We need to know who these spirits are and why they're haunting it." Jake nodded. "Let's start with the local library. There must be records of the accidents, maybe even some information about the victims." The library was a quiet refuge, its musty scent and rows of books providing a stark contrast to the night's terror. They split up, searching through old newspapers, town records, and any other documents they could find about the bridge and its tragic history. Emily soon found herself immersed in the stories of the past. The first documented accident dated back to the early 1900s, when a carriage had veered off the bridge during a storm, plunging into the river below. The driver and his passenger, a young woman, were both killed. As the years passed, the accidents continued, each more gruesome than the last. There was the story of a family whose car had mysteriously stalled on the bridge in the 1950s, much like their own experience. They had been found the next morning, their faces twisted in terror with no signs of what had caused their deaths. Another tale told of a group of teenagers in the 1970s, much like Emily and her friends, who had dared each other to cross the bridge at midnight. Only one had survived, driven mad by what he had witnessed, spending the rest of his days in an asylum, muttering about glowing eyes and cold hands. Emily's hands trembled as she read the accounts, the faces of the victims staring back at her from faded photographs. The more she learned, the clearer it became that the bridge was a magnet for tragedy, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was perilously thin. Jake found an old journal belonging to the bridge's original builder, Samuel Wilcox. The entries were filled with cryptic references to dark forces and unseen eyes watching him as he worked. One entry in particular stood out. June 13th, 1898. The bridge is nearly complete, but the cost has been great. I feel a presence, as if the spirits of those who once inhabited this land are displeased. I fear we have disturbed something ancient, something that will not rest. Emily closed the journal, her heart heavy with the weight of the past. The spirits of the ghostly bridge were not just random ghosts. They were the echoes of countless tragedies, the souls of those who had met untimely deaths, trapped between worlds, seeking closure or vengeance. As they left the library, Emily knew their journey was far from over. The spirits of the bridge had revealed themselves, and now it was up to them to uncover the truth, and hopefully find a way to bring peace to the restless souls. But as they walked into the sunlight, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of the darkness that lurked beneath the bridge, and that darkness was watching, waiting for them to return. The evening sun dipped below the horizon as Emily, Jake, Sarah, and Mike gathered at a small diner on the outskirts of town. They had come to meet someone who might shed more light on the mysteries of the ghostly bridge, a trucker named Bill Hansen, who had narrowly escaped an encounter with the supernatural there. Bill arrived a few minutes later, a burly man with weathered skin and eyes that spoke of long nights on the road. He settled into the booth across from them, his expression a mix of curiosity and wariness. "So, you're the kids who've been poking around the old bridge," Bill said, his voice gravelly. "Why do you want to know about it?" Emily leaned forward, her eyes earnest. "We had an experience there last night, and we've been researching the accidents. We found your name mentioned in one of the reports from a few years back. We thought you might be able to help us understand what's happening." Bill sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't like talking about that night, but if it helps you stay safe, I'll tell you what I saw." He took a sip of his coffee before beginning his tale. "It was about 5 years ago. I was driving a late shift, hauling cargo to the next town over. I'd crossed that bridge 100 times, never thought much of it. But that night, something was different. The mist was thicker than I'd ever seen, like a wall of fog just waiting for me." Bill's eyes grew distant, lost in the memory. "As I got to the bridge, my headlights barely cut through the fog. I slowed down, figuring I'd better take it easy. That's when I saw them, figures standing in the middle of the bridge. At first I thought they were just kids messing around, but then I noticed how they didn't move, didn't flinch as my truck approached." He paused, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "I hit the brakes hard. My truck skidded, tires screeching, but the figures stayed put. I stopped just a few feet from them. They were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes glowed." Sarah shivered, hugging her arms around herself. "What did you do?" Bill's voice dropped to a whisper. "I tried to reverse, but my truck wouldn't budge. It was like something was holding it in place. Then I heard it, a low moaning, like the wind, but filled with sorrow and anger. I looked back at the figures and they were closer, moving without moving. Just there." Emily felt a chill run down her spine as Bill continued. "One of them, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, reached out to me. Her hand went right through the windshield, and I felt this icy cold spread through me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then, just as suddenly, they were gone. The fog lifted, and my truck started again. I didn't stick around to see what would happen next." The group sat in stunned silence, absorbing Bill's story. He looked at them, his eyes dark with warning. "That bridge is cursed, no doubt about it. The spirits there aren't just lost souls. They're angry, vengeful. I If you're smart, you'll stay away." Jake leaned forward, his expression serious. "Thank you for telling us. We're trying to find a way to help those spirits move on, to break the curse." Bill shook his head. "You're playing with fire, kid. But if you're set on this, be careful. The bridge has a way of getting into your head, making you see things, feel things. Don't let it take you like it almost took me." As Bill left the diner, Emily felt a renewed sense of urgency. The spirits of the ghostly bridge were real, and their anger was palpable. They needed to find a way to help these restless souls, to put an end to the cycle of death and terror that had plagued the bridge for over a century. But how? The answer remained elusive, hidden in the mists that clung to the bridge like a shroud. And as the night deepened, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that their quest was only beginning, and the true horror of the bridge was yet to be revealed. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Emily received a panicked call from Sarah. The voice on the other end of the line was almost unrecognizable, trembling and choked with fear. "Emily, you have to come over now. It's Mike. He went back to the bridge last night and now he's gone. We can't find him." Emily's heart raced. She had barely slept, her mind haunted by the trucker's story and the images from the footage they had reviewed. She grabbed her jacket and rushed out the door, heading straight for Sarah's house. When she arrived, Sarah and Jake were huddled together in the living room, their faces pale and drawn. Sarah's eyes were red from crying, and Jake looked like he hadn't slept at all. "Tell me everything," Emily demanded, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "After we left the diner, Mike was acting strange. He kept saying we needed more evidence, that we hadn't seen everything there was to see. He was obsessed. I told him to let it go, but he wouldn't listen. Late last night, he texted me saying he was going back to the bridge alone. I tried calling him, but he didn't pick up. This morning, his car was found near the bridge, but there's no sign of him." Emily felt a cold dread settle over her. "We need to find him. Now." They drove to the bridge in tense silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. When they arrived, the mist was already beginning to rise from the river, curling around the bridge like a living thing. Mike's car was parked haphazardly at the side of the road, the driver's door open and the keys still in the ignition. "Mike!" Jake shouted, his voice echoing in the still air. "Mike, where are you?" There was no response, only the eerie silence of the bridge and the distant murmur of the river below. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew they had to act quickly. The longer Mike was missing, the more danger he was in. They spread out, searching the area around the bridge, calling Mike's name. As Emily walked along the bridge, her heart pounded in her chest, every creak and groan of the old structure amplifying her fear. Then she saw it, a faint glow in the mist, the same eerie light they had seen the night before. Her breath caught in her throat as she moved closer, the light growing brighter. It was coming from the middle of the bridge where the figures had appeared. "Jake, Sarah, over here!" she called, her voice shaking. They rushed to her side, their eyes widening in horror as they saw the light. As they approached, the glow intensified, revealing a shadowy figure standing at the center of the bridge. "Mike," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with hope and fear. But as they got closer, the figure became clearer. It was not Mike. It was one of the spirits, its eyes glowing with that unearthly light, its expression one of sorrow and rage. Emily felt a cold chill wash over her, freezing her in place. The spirit raised a hand, pointing towards the river. Emily followed its gaze and saw something that made her blood run cold. Mike's backpack, half submerged in the water, caught on a jagged piece of metal jutting out from the riverbank. "No," Sarah whimpered, tears streaming down her face. Jake moved to the edge of the bridge, peering into the murky depths. "We need to get down there," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. They scrambled down the steep bank, slipping on the wet grass and loose stones. Emily's heart pounded in her ears as they reached the river's edge. Jake waded into the water, grabbing the backpack and pulling it to shore. Inside, they found Mike's camera, still intact despite the water damage. Emily turned it on, praying that it still worked. The screen flickered to life, showing the last moments Mike had recorded. The footage was shaky, Mike's voice barely audible over the sound of the rushing river. He was talking to the camera, documenting his experience. Then suddenly the camera swung around, capturing the ghostly figures emerging from the mist. Mike's breathing grew heavy, panicked, as the figures closed in on him. The last thing the camera recorded was Mike's terrified face, his eyes wide with fear, before the screen went black. Emily's hands shook as she turned off the camera, her mind racing. Mike had been taken by the spirits, just like the others. And now they were faced with an even greater challenge, rescuing him from the clutches of the vengeful ghosts that haunted the ghostly bridge. As they stood by the river, the mist thickening around them, Emily knew they couldn't turn back. They had to save Mike and find a way to put the spirits to rest. The darkness was closing in, and time was running out. Emily, Jake, and Sarah retreated from the riverbank, their spirits weighed down by fear and uncertainty. They knew they couldn't face the malevolent entities without understanding more about the curse that bound them to the ghostly bridge. The next step was clear. They needed expert help. Emily suggested contacting Dr. Harold Whitmore, a renowned paranormal investigator and author who had written extensively about haunted sites. That afternoon, Emily made the call. To her relief, Dr. Whitmore agreed to meet them. They convened in the living room of Emily's house, a place now crowded with research notes, old newspaper clippings, and the eerie footage from Mike's camera. Dr. Whitmore was an imposing figure, his sharp features softened only by the curiosity and intelligence in his eyes. He listened intently as Emily recounted their experiences and shared the video evidence. "The ghostly bridge, you say?" Dr. Whitmore mused, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "I've heard whispers of this place. The spirits are bound by something powerful, something dark. We must find the source." Jake showed him the journal of Samuel Wilcox, the bridge's builder. Dr. Whitmore's eyes lit up with recognition. "Ah, this is a significant clue. Wilcox was known for his unorthodox practices. There are rumors he dabbled in dark rituals, hoping to harness supernatural forces to strengthen his constructions." Sarah's eyes widened. "You mean he might have cursed the bridge himself?" Dr. Whitmore nodded gravely. "It's possible. If Wilcox performed a ritual during the construction, he could have inadvertently trapped the souls of those who died on the bridge." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. How do we break the curse? How do we free the spirits and find Mike? Dr. Whitmore sighed. "We need to uncover the specifics of Wilcox's ritual. There might be something in the town archives or Wilcox's personal belongings. We should start there." The town hall was their next destination, its ancient records room a treasure trove of historical documents. They combed through stacks of papers, searching for anything related to Samuel Wilcox and the construction of the bridge. Hours passed, and the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the room. Finally, Sarah found a faded ledger detailing the bridge's construction. In the margins, Wilcox had scribbled strange symbols and notes about an invocation of protection. Dr. Whitmore studied the symbols carefully. "These are ancient runes, often used in rituals to bind spirits," he explained. "But there's something else here. A counter-ritual, a way to undo the binding." Emily's heart leapt with hope. "Can we perform it? Will it free the spirits and help us find Mike?" Dr. Whitmore nodded slowly. "It's dangerous, but we have no choice. We must gather the necessary items and return to the bridge at midnight, when the spirits are most active." They spent the next few hours gathering the required items: candles, salt, and a mirror inscribed with the counter-ritual symbols. The air was thick with tension as they prepared, each of them knowing that failure was not an option. As midnight approached, they returned to the ghostly bridge. The mist was thicker than ever, swirling ominously around the old structure. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as they set up the ritual, the candles casting flickering shadows in the fog. Dr. Whitmore began to chant the ancient words, his voice steady and commanding. The air grew colder, and the mist seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Emily and Sarah spread the salt in a protective circle, while Jake held the mirror, his hands shaking. Suddenly, the ghostly figures appeared, their eyes glowing with anger and sorrow. Emily felt a surge of fear, but stood her ground, repeating the counter-ritual along with Dr. Whitmore. The spirits advanced, their wails filling the night air. But as the ritual progressed, a change began to take place. The figures flickered, their forms becoming less solid, less menacing. Emily could see the pain and confusion in their eyes, and she felt a pang of sympathy. With a final, powerful incantation, Dr. Whitmore raised the mirror, reflecting the moonlight onto the spirits. There was a blinding flash, and the figures dissolved into the mist, their wails turning into whispers, then silence. The mist began to clear, and the air warmed slightly. Emily felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "Did it work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Whitmore nodded, his expression weary but satisfied. "The spirits are free. The curse is broken." But their relief was short-lived. Jake's eyes widened as he looked towards the river. "Mike!" They rushed to the riverbank where Mike lay unconscious, his body half submerged in the water. They pulled him to safety and Dr. Whitmore checked his vitals. "He's alive," Dr. Whitmore said, "but we need to get him to a hospital." As they carried Mike back to the car, Emily felt a sense of accomplishment mingled with the lingering unease. They had broken the curse, but the memory of the spirit's anguish and the darkness that had pervaded the ghostly bridge would haunt her forever. And as they drove away, the bridge stood silent behind them, a relic of a dark past finally at peace. The hospital was a blur of bright lights and hurried voices as Emily, Jake, and Sarah waited anxiously in the lobby. Mike had been admitted, and the doctors assured them he would recover, though they couldn't explain his sudden disappearance or how he had ended up in the river. Exhaustion settled over the group like a heavy blanket, but Emily's mind was still racing. "We need to find out more about Samuel Wilcox," she said, breaking the silence. "There has to be more to this story." Jake nodded. "We should start with the Historical Society. If Wilcox had a hand in cursing the bridge, there might be more records about him there." The next morning they visited the town's Historical Society, a small, dusty building filled with ancient books and forgotten relics. Mrs. Henderson, the society's curator, greeted them warmly and led them to a back room where old town records were stored. "We're looking for information on Samuel Wilcox," Emily explained. "Anything you have on him?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened. "Wilcox? Oh, he was quite a character. There's a lot of folklore surrounding him, some of it quite dark. Let me see what I can find." She returned with a box of old documents and a large leather-bound book. "This journal belonged to Wilcox," she said. "It's one of our oldest artifacts. Be careful with it." Emily opened the journal, its pages yellowed with age. The entries were written in Wilcox's spidery handwriting, filled with technical details about the bridge's construction, but also with cryptic references to rituals and spirits. One entry caught her eye. October 31st, 1897. "The bridge nears completion, but I am troubled. The land upon which it stands is old, sacred to those who came before. I have invoked protections, but there is unrest. The spirits are not pleased. I fear I have unleashed something I cannot control." Emily shivered, the words resonating with the experiences they had faced. She continued reading, and another entry stood out. November 12th, 1897. "I met with the bridgekeeper today, a man who knows the old ways. He spoke of a binding ritual, a way to control the spirits and ensure the bridge's safety. But the cost is high. The spirits must be appeased, their anger sated. I am desperate. I will do what must be done." "Who's the bridgekeeper?" Jake asked, peering over her shoulder. Mrs. Henderson's face grew serious. "The bridgekeeper was a local legend, a man said to possess ancient knowledge and the power to commune with spirits. Some say he was a shaman, others a warlock. His true identity was never known, but he was feared and respected." Sarah frowned. "So Wilcox used the bridgekeeper's ritual to bind the spirits to the bridge. That's what caused all the deaths?" Mrs. Henderson nodded. "It seems likely. If Wilcox performed the ritual incorrectly or without fully understanding its consequences, it could have trapped the spirits in a state of unrest." Emily's mind raced. "But we broke the curse. The spirits are free now, right?" Mrs. Henderson sighed. "Perhaps. But if there are other elements of the ritual or other spirits bound to the bridge, you might not be out of danger yet. The bridgekeeper's knowledge was vast and secretive." Jake looked determined. "We need to find out more about the bridgekeeper. There has to be a way to ensure the spirits are truly at rest." They spent the rest of the day combing through more records and old town legends. They found references to the bridgekeeper in various accounts, always described as a mysterious figure with deep ties to the supernatural. One particularly chilling account told of a young woman who had sought the bridgekeeper's help to communicate with her deceased husband, only to be driven mad by the spirits she encountered. As night fell, they left the Historical Society with heavy hearts and more questions than answers. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial, something that tied Wilcox, the bridgekeeper, and the haunted bridge together. Back at her house, Emily spread out the documents and journal entries, trying to piece together the puzzle. As she pored over the faded words, a realization struck her. "Jake, Sarah, look at this." She pointed to a passage in the journal. "The spirits demand a guardian, one who will watch over the bridge and ensure their rest. The ritual must be completed by the blood of the builder or his kin." "Blood of the builder," Jake murmured. "Wilcox's bloodline?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Do you think Wilcox's descendants are still in town? Could they be the key to completing the ritual?" Emily nodded slowly. "It's possible. We need to find out if any of Wilcox's relatives are still here. They might hold the final piece to this mystery." Determined, they set out to track down Wilcox's descendants, hoping to finally bring peace to the restless spirits of the ghostly bridge and uncover the true legacy of the bridgekeeper's secret. Tracking down the descendants of Samuel Wilcox proved to be more difficult than they had anticipated. Days passed as they scoured town records, spoke to local historians, and knocked on countless doors. Their search led them to an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, where an elderly woman named Evelyn Wilcox lived alone. Evelyn was a frail, sharp-eyed woman who greeted them with suspicion. But when Emily explained their situation and showed her the journal, Evelyn's demeanor softened. "My great-grandfather was a troubled man," Evelyn said, her voice tinged with sadness. "He believed he could control forces beyond his understanding. The bridge keeper. He warned Samuel, but desperation makes fools of us all." They sat in Evelyn's cozy living room, the walls adorned with photographs and heirlooms. Evelyn revealed that Samuel had indeed performed a binding ritual to protect the bridge, but he had been unaware of the full consequences. The spirits were bound, but their anger and sorrow had turned them into vengeful entities, trapped in a cycle of torment. "Great-grandfather knew he had made a grave mistake," Evelyn said, tears in her eyes. "He wrote about it in his journal. There is one final ritual that can put the spirits to rest, but it requires a descendant of the Wilcox bloodline and the completion of the bridgekeeper's incantation." Evelyn handed them a worn piece of parchment covered in ancient symbols. "This is the bridgekeeper's final incantation. It must be spoken at the stroke of midnight, with the blood of a Wilcox to seal it." Emily, Jake, and Sarah exchanged glances, determination etched on their faces. "We'll do it," Emily said. "We'll end this once and for all." Evelyn insisted on coming with them, despite her age. "I must see this through," she said firmly. "It's my family's burden." That night, they gathered once more at the ghostly bridge, the mist swirling ominously around them. Dr. Whitmore had agreed to assist, bringing his expertise and a calm presence that reassured them all. They set up the ritual site with candles, salt, and the mirror, just as before. But this time, Evelyn stood at the center, holding the parchment with the incantation. As the clock ticked towards midnight, Emily felt the air grow colder, the mist thickening until it was almost suffocating. The bridge creaked and groaned, the sound echoing through the night. At the stroke of midnight, Evelyn began to recite the incantation, her voice strong and unwavering. The ancient words filled the air, resonating with a power that sent shivers down Emily's spine. The ghostly figures began to appear, their forms flickering in and out of existence, their eyes glowing with a mix of anger and hope. Emily watched as the spirits advanced, their expression shifting from rage to sorrow. They seemed drawn to Evelyn, as if recognizing her as the key to their salvation. The air hummed with energy, the mist swirling faster, and the spirits' wails growing louder. Suddenly, one of the spirits, a young woman with a look of profound sadness, stepped forward. Evelyn met her gaze, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," Evelyn whispered. "I'm so sorry for what my family has done." The young woman nodded, her eyes softening. She reached out, placing a ghostly hand over Evelyn's heart. Evelyn winced but did not falter. With a final, trembling breath, Evelyn pricked her finger with a small knife, letting a drop of her blood fall onto the parchment. The reaction was immediate. The symbols on the parchment glowed with a brilliant light, and the mist swirled into a vortex, pulling the spirits towards it. The air was filled with the sound of their wails, but this time, it was a sound of release, of relief. Emily watched in awe as the spirits were drawn into the vortex, their forms dissolving into the mist. The light grew brighter, blinding, and then, with a final flash, it was gone. The bridge stood silent and still, the mist cleared, and the air was warm once more. Evelyn collapsed, and Dr. Whitmore rushed to her side, checking her vitals. "She's exhausted, but she'll be okay," he said, relief evident in his voice. Emily, Jake, and Sarah helped Evelyn to her feet, guiding her back to the car. As they drove away, Emily glanced back at the bridge one last time. It stood as a silent sentinel over the river, its curse finally lifted. The spirits were at peace, and Mike was safe. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. But Emily knew the memory of the bridge and its haunting would stay with them forever, a reminder of the power of the past and the bravery required to confront it. As the sun rose on a new day, Emily felt a sense of closure, mingled with a deep respect for the spirits they had helped to free. The ghostly bridge would no longer be a place of fear, but a testament to the enduring strength of those who dared to challenge the darkness. The days following their confrontation at the ghostly bridge were surreal. Mike had been released from the hospital, physically unharmed but deeply shaken by his ordeal. Emily, Jake, and Sarah took turns visiting him, offering comfort and trying to process what they had all been through. Emily sat on the porch of her house one warm afternoon, a cup of tea in her hands, when she saw Jake walking up the path. He looked better than he had in days, though the haunted look in his eyes lingered. "Hey," Jake greeted, taking a seat next to her. "How are you holding up?" Emily shrugged. "I'm managing. It's just a lot to take in. I keep thinking about the spirits, about what they went through." Jake nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, I've been thinking about that too. I think it's going to take some time to really understand it all." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared experience settling between them. Then Emily spoke. "Do you think the bridge is really at peace now?" Jake looked thoughtful. "I hope so. We did everything we could. Dr. Whitmore said the ritual should have released the spirits, but it's hard to know for sure." Emily sighed. "I keep wondering if there's more we could have done. If there are other places like the bridge, other spirits trapped and angry." Jake put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We did the best we could, Em. We faced something most people would never believe, and we came through it. We should be proud of that." Emily nodded, feeling a bit of the tension ease. "You're right. I guess it's just hard to let go of the fear." Jake smiled faintly. "Fear has a way of sticking with you, but we have to move forward. We have to live our lives." Over the next few weeks, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. They resumed their daily routines, though the bond forged by their harrowing experience remained strong. Mike, once the most skeptical among them, had become more introspective, often reflecting on the fragility of life and the mysteries that lay just beyond their understanding. One evening, the group gathered at Emily's house for a quiet dinner. Evelyn Wilcox joined them, her presence a comforting reminder of the connection they now shared. "How are you feeling, Evelyn?" Sarah asked, pouring her a cup of tea. Evelyn smiled warmly. "I'm doing well, dear. It's strange, but I feel lighter, as if a great burden has been lifted. I think my great-grandfather would be relieved to know the spirits are at peace." Dr. Whitmore, who had become a close friend and mentor, raised his glass. "To all of you, you faced the unknown with courage and compassion. You honored those spirits and helped them find rest. That's no small feat." They clinked glasses, the room filled with a sense of accomplishment and camaraderie. Emily looked around the table, feeling grateful for each of them and the journey they had undertaken together. As the evening wore on, they shared stories, laughed, and for the first time in weeks, felt a true sense of peace. The ghostly bridge was no longer a place of fear and tragedy, but a symbol of their resilience and the power of confronting the darkness. Later that night, Emily stood on her porch, gazing up at the stars. The events of the past weeks played through her mind, a whirlwind of fear, determination, and ultimate triumph. She knew she would never forget the spirits they had encountered or the lessons they had learned. But she also knew that life went on, and the world was full of mysteries waiting to be explored. With a final deep breath, she turned back towards the house, ready to face whatever came next, knowing she was stronger for the journey she had taken. As she closed the door behind her, the night was still and calm, the bridge standing quietly in the distance, no longer haunted by the past but looking towards a future of peace and remembrance.